I'm a 27-year-old female, and this happened when I was 24. I live in Los Angeles, and have for my entire life. I was feeling lonely, so I decided to go on Craigslist to try to find someone to hang out with. I know I'm dumb. Not necessarily a date, but just someone to chill with. If it led somewhere, then so be it. That was my thinking. I emailed with a few guys, one of them which stood out to me. He sent me some pictures, and I was fine with how he looked, and he seemed nice enough. We agreed to meet up and go have coffee. It took him a lot longer than he said it would have to get there, and once he did arrive, I instantly regretted what I was doing. But, being overly polite and feeling awkward, I went on. I got in his car, and instead of heading to Starbucks as planned, he drove to a CVS. I was like, what are we doing here? To which he said he had to return some stuff to CVS so that way we had some money. I was super uncomfortable already and just wanted to get out of there. But again, my shyness got the better of me, and I just waited it out. Once he returned whatever it was he was returning, he then said that he had to stop by his apartment. We pulled into his underground garage, and he said that he'd be right back. You don't know how badly I wish I had run right then while he was gone, but I didn't. He got back in the car, and I could tell right away that he was high on an upper, probably meth. Having been to rehab before myself, it was blatantly obvious. I told him I'd got an emergency phone call while he was upstairs, and that I was sorry but I had to be taken back. I told him he could just drop me off at the nearest train station. I lived in a city about an hour away, so I wasn't about to have him drive me all the way home. We got on the freeway that was the fastest route to the train stop, but we ended up passing by the exit. I'd told him a few miles ahead of time which one it was, but he didn't say anything, seemingly ignoring me. I thought maybe he just hadn't heard me. Hey, that was the exit actually. You passed it, I said. Instead of pulling over into the right lanes, he kept pulling farther and farther over to the left until we were all the way in the far left-hand lane. I asked him what he was doing, trying to keep my cool. I can't honestly remember his exact words, but it was something along the lines of, "I'm not dropping you off. We're having sex. Why do you think I did this?" I looked at him with my jaw to the ground and asked him, "So you're refusing to drop me off?" He said yes and sped up the car. The first thing I thought of was obviously calling the police, so I pulled out my cell phone. He turned towards me and hit me in the face, hard, and I dropped my phone because I was so shocked. The phone had fallen somewhere below his seat, somewhere I couldn't get to. I was panicking. As we continued to drive, I tried desperately to think of what I should do. We came up on another interstate, the 5. For some reason, seeing the freeways intersect and seeing that we were about to get on yet another freeway was hugely ominous to me, and I decided I could not let him go on the next freeway. I couldn't jump out of the car. I'd die instantly. So I did the only other thing I could think of. I took a breath and grabbed the steering wheel, turning it as hard as I could to the right. He was so shocked he didn't even try to grab it back from me, as we crashed into one, then another car, and crashing into the side barrier. He turned towards me again and started hitting me while screaming, "You bitch! You fucking bitch! You fucked everything up!" I put my legs up to block the blows from his fists, and it worked. I ended up falling backwards out of the car, after managing my hand backwards to open the door. I ran to one of the other cars we'd crashed into. They had pulled over behind us. The guy was on his cell phone, presumably calling the cops. I knocked on his window, screaming that the psycho tried to kidnap me. And he rolled it up all the way. It had been down like a third of the way when I walked up and knocked on it. I couldn't believe it. When I looked back, Psycho was coming towards me. So I said, "Screw this. Clearly no one's going to help," and ran towards the fence. I'm already not in amazing shape, and was even weaker because of what had happened, so I literally had to lean on the fence until it bent enough for me to fall over it. Climbing up a chain link fence was not an option at that moment. Luckily, instead of following me, he ran the other direction. He just left his car on the side of the freeway. Once I was over the fence, I realized that I was on some horse trails that I was familiar with because I had worked at the equestrian center nearby. So I just walked through the miles of trail until I got to the nearest city, which was Burbank, and called the cops from a bowling alley. I never found out what happened to that psycho. The cops never told me after I made the report, but I hope he got in some kind of trouble for, trying to kidnap me. This story is from my grandmother, who is the eldest of 5 children. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, her family lived in a small farming town hit hard by the Great Dust Bowl before they moved to the West Coast. The farms were big flatlands, with patches of forest in between, where vagrants would occasionally make their home as they begged for employment. Most would eventually leave for bigger towns, in the cities on the opposite side of the coast. The town where my grandmother was born was small and scattered, but tightly knit. Everyone knew each other. Needless to say, the police authority was non-existent in those parts, and at the time phone communication was limited. So when something happened, it was the local townsfolk who would take matters into their own hands in order to protect the community. My grandmother was around 5 years old. Let's call her Doris. She and her 4-year-old sister Daisy were out in an empty field playing alone, as they did almost every day. Their mother was occupied in the house, taking care of a newborn baby boy, and their father had gone into town to get some supplies. As I stated, their farm was very remote, and they rarely got visitors, but when they did, you could see the dust kick up from the wheels of the car miles away. I think this is why my great-grandmother, who was 22 at the time, felt secure enough to let her defenses down and allow her young daughters free rein to play far from her sight, though she taught her girls to run home right away if they ever saw dust from a truck. What happened one peculiar summer day changed everything. Doris and Daisy had decided to play near the border of their property. They had taken shelter in the shade of some corn stalks that had survived the harsh season. Doris and Daisy were tired after a long game of tag and were ready to go home for lunch. They left the corn patch and out into the open, and that's when they saw the man. My grandmother had never seen this man before and does not remember much about him or his features, other than that he was big and wearing overalls. But even at 5 years old and raised in the shelter of an isolated farming community, there was something about the way he was looking at them that made alarm bells go off in her head. Suddenly, the house and her mother seemed so far away, and she screamed for her little sister to run. They ran back into the corn patch and burst through the other side, and ran and ran and ran, not once ever looking back, utterly terrified to see the big man closing in on them. My grandmother was crying and calling out to her mother by the time she reached the house, and my great-grandmother opened the front door. Doris was shaking and terrified. Her world had been turned upside down. It was her first account with an adult that only had bad intentions, and it had happened near to her home. It only got worse when her mother urgently asked, "Where's Daisy? Where's your sister?" She was gone. My great-grandmother was nearly hysterical by the time her husband returned from town. He loaded up his shotgun and took back off in his truck. The details get a little fuzzy at this point, as it is from the perspective of a frightened 5-year-old. But my great-grandfather eventually returned home hours later with some neighbors, and with Daisy. Daisy had been found on the neighbor's property, in the middle of a field. She was filthy, her clothes were torn up, and she would not speak due to shock. That is all I'm willing to say about what happened to her. I cannot imagine how my great-grandmother, at 22 years of age, or any parent could cope with such an unspeakable thing happening to their child. It utterly sickens me. As the evening progressed, word spread amongst the farmers, and more people appeared at the house. Women, wives and their children came over to offer my great-grandmother comfort and support, while the men, the husbands and older sons, milled about smoking cigarettes outside with my great-grandfather, who had, as my grandmother said, a scary look on his face that she would never forget. He was 25 at the time. All the farmers had brought their dogs and shotguns. They did not speak about it openly, but they all knew what happened to Daisy, and they also knew exactly what had to be done. Once all the women and their children were inside, the men got into their trucks and drove off, leaving a few behind to guard the farmhouse. My grandmother did not know until years later that all of the women and children in town had been gathered at her house for a specific reason. The reason being that her father and all the menfolk had gone into the woods to search for that big man in overalls. They returned before dawn the next day, and after the townsfolk had left, neither of my great-grandparents ever spoke of that night again. I think it was a factor in their decision to move out to the Midwest and into the Pacific Northwest of America not too long after that. Whenever my grandmother would try to bring it up, her mother would firmly say, "We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about something else." And that would be the end of that. Only my grandmother and her sister have any recollection of that horrible memory. Things were done differently back then. There was no counseling services to help my family deal with that sort of trauma. As a result of her abduction, Daisy has agoraphobia, a fear of being in open spaces outside of the shelter of a safe space. Daisy was lucky to have survived, and I'm happy to say that both she and my grandmother remained close and had happily married with children of their own. What happened with my family had occurred nearly 80 years ago. There are no records. The police were never involved, and my great-grandparents, and I assume the townsfolk as well, would never speak of it. My grandmother, Doris, and I are certain that her father and the farmers had done away with the big man in overalls who had assaulted one of their children and buried his worthless corpse in the woods, unmarked and forgotten. I have mixed feelings about this. The townsfolk had taken the initiative to deal with a very real danger in their community and permanently removed the threat. If that same man had committed that crime now, he would have been treated more with sympathy as having a sickness, and would, like so many who have committed such terrible crimes on children, be released into society as a registered sex offender. My cousin is a survivor of such a sex offender, and he will be released early on parole next month for good behavior after serving 10 out of a 15-year sentence for systematically sexually assaulting a minor. In that time, my cousin had come to cope with the fact that he would eventually be released and the possibility of encountering him in a public area. I sometimes compare those two events in my family side by side. Small-town vigilante justice versus the modern judicial system. Expensive, drawn out, prone to compromise in support of the assailant due to overcrowded prisons. Because of my personal bias witnessing the trauma in two different generations in my family, I find myself preferring the shotgun approach. A sadistic registered child sex offender about to be released back into society next month, who I am certain will again devastate another young life. I can't say the same for the big man in overalls, buried in some unmarked grave in the woods. At least we know for certain he never harmed another child. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to urmaker6260@gmail.com. So I want to give a big thank you to everyone who made it to the live stream on Friday the 13th. It was nice getting to chat with you guys, and I had a lot of fun. During that live stream I had mentioned about going back to my upload schedule of 5 days a week-ish, but 6 to 10 minute videos. I think I'm going to actually go ahead and do that, and I'm going to go ahead and do 5 or 6 days a week, 6 to 12 minute videos, something like that, and then Sundays I'm going to go ahead and do a compilation. So that way all the people liking the longer videos can just watch Sunday if they want and get all the stories. And those people who like to listen and keep up to date can listen to them as they come out. And if you're looking for more creepy stories, I just uploaded a couple on Urmaker from the paranormal side. Feel free to come check them out. I'll have a link in the comments and description. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.